Jamie.
And I'm Dami.
And we have a hometown history podcast series where we go around all of York County, and this is the first time we've come to Adams County talking about local history. So tonight our presentation will last about 35 to 45 minutes, then we'll have some time with some Q&A. And tonight's presentation is called The Confederate Occupation of Hanover. We are here, for those of you online, at Seminary Ridge Museum, and as Jim said, we are very honored to be welcomed here to speak at Gettysburg, so thank you, Cody, for giving us the podium. That was very gracious of you.
So our agenda tonight, we're going to start with the Battle of Hanover, before, during, and after, and then we're going to talk about a man named Old Uncle Sam and Abraham Lincoln.
I was an educator before this, so we always walk away with takeaways, things that we want you to know by the end of our presentation. Number one is that the Battle of Hanover was a first. This was the first Civil War cavalry battle that happened in York County, and it was the single bloodiest event in York County history. Show of hands, how many of you are from York County? Okay, how many of you are from Adams County?
Okay.
And how many of you are not from York or Adams County? A few of you. Excellent. Okay.
Well, thanks for coming.
Yeah, so we're very centric in York, and like we said, today is going to focus a lot on Hanover, of course, getting into some Gettysburg as well. The second main takeaway is that when we look at the Battle of Hanover, it really was a story of defenders. This town during this time was at its best. These were civilians who were unprepared to handle mass casualties, and they stepped up to the plate. The Hanover people are a part of the story of the outnumbered Union force that kept the Confederate force from invading. And then finally, the impact of this. This was a very important battle in that it prevented the eyes and ears from, Lee's eyes and ears from getting to Gettysburg for the first day and a half of the battle. So just a quick tour about Hanover too. There's a little promo to go down there.
Yeah, so Hanover has storyboards, which facilitate a walking tour, and you can get copies at the main street in Hanover. And then Explore York has kiosks and offices on Main Street, Hanover on York Street, and McAllister's on York. So these digital storyboards can be seen on Witnessing York, which is Jamie and Jim's website, where they tell stories about York County history.
So like we said, my name is Jamie Norpel. I used to be a high school history teacher for 10 years up at Milton Hershey School. I've since transitioned and I work for a nonprofit. I've got my master's and PhD in American Studies from Penn State. I run a website called Witnessing York with Jim, and then a local history blog called Wondering in York County.
Yeah, and I'm Dami, and I'm the Third Circuit Court of Appeals librarian for the Middle District in Harrisburg, and I'm a Civil War reenactor, so it's perfect to be here tonight. Shout out to the 87th PA. And I run Preserving the History of Newburytown and the Hanover Area History Lovers Group.
We like history.
We do.
I think we have a thing for history.
Yeah, just a little bit.
So you can go watch more of our videos if you go to Hometown History, Jamie and Dami's Yoko Backstory. We're on YouTube and Instagram and Facebook and Spotify.
Yeah, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts.
Dami is our marketer. She's great at that.
And we just had our 3rd year anniversary of Hometown History.
3 years.
Yeah.
So now let's go back in time to what it was like in Hanover in the 1800s. So this is a picture of Hanover Commons, and it would have reached its industrial peak at the end of the 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century. At this time, the railroads and the depot were opened, specifically in 1852, and this really developed our industry. So in Hanover, there were lots of businesses. We had a dye maker, a feed mill, a distilling company, a lumber and coal yard, a foundry, water wheel manufacturing, cattle yard, hemp factory, firehouse, and market house. So Hanover was a poppin' time during 150 years ago. And so this area really has a long-standing history of people who were hands-on and self-reliant.
Right. And the Battle of Hanover was a significant Civil War battle. It had 300 casualties, meaning dead, wounded, or missing. So, one of the bloodiest things to ever happen on York County soil. So to set the scene for you, on June 30th, 1863, Confederate General Jeb Stuart's cavalry consisted of 4,500 men, and they outnumbered Union General Kilpatrick's cavalry of only 3,500 men. So we were at a disadvantage.
So when the Confederates, they charged along Frederick Street and through the farm fields at the time that belonged to Carl Forney, they were chasing the fleeing Union rear guard as they were waiting in breakfast line that was staffed by the townspeople. And when they crashed, they reached the 18th Pennsylvania Cavalry Regiment.
So the Confederates ended up plunging into the column of Union soldiers, and soon the Union cavalry backed up, withdrawing north to the railroad tracks on present-day Broadway. And there, the Union counterattacked. So you have to imagine that these men from New York and Pennsylvania were fighting face-to-face with men from North Carolina and Virginia. At this time, we were still using Napoleonic war tactics, so you were literally just across from each other, shooting at people not that far away from you. So it's a lot different than war is today, and I think it made it more bloody, more emotional, yes,
yeah,
is a good way to put it.
Yeah, and we don't want to pretend that like reenacting is exactly what it was like. However,
Right.
Dami, you are a reenactor.
On a much smaller scale, it really humanizes it for you. You know, you're looking into other people's eyes. When we reenact, usually if you make eye contact with the person across from you, that's saying, I shot you and you should fall over. They really don't do that. It gets annoying. You can shoot the same Confederate like 5 times and they just stand there like nothing happened.
You just run at them screaming, like, I shot you! Like,
I wish. But it really does sort of bring it home on, you know, how close you are to the enemy.
Yeah.
So
there's a local historian who described it, or a historian called John Preps, who described it as, because of the fluid nature of the battle, unit cohesion was lost as the fighting degenerated into a whirlwind of hand-to-hand melees in the streets, alleys, and surrounding fields. So I like to think about that hand-to-hand combat and the amount of bravery, courage, and fear that must have been in these people's emotions. It must have been a terrible time. So new troops from the Union soldiers, they actually tipped the balance in Union's favor. So with the addition of reinforcements, the Union made another charge, which really confused the Confederates even more. So the rebels were driven southwest of Hanover into higher grounds, and then the Hanover Center once again was under Union control.
right, and this was the Union counterattack, and it ended up being a success, and 20 worn-out Confederates were taken as prisoners that day. And an unidentified Union private from Vermont had claimed to have captured Confederate Lieutenant Colonel Payne, and another Union private named Abram Folger of New York also claimed to have captured him. And he said, we captured one of their colonels in an old tan hat into which his horse had fallen. His gray uniform with its velvet facing and white gauntlet gloves, his face and hair had all been completely stained. So you had 2 people claiming to capture the same person. So someone was right, someone was wrong.
Not right. So by 11 a.m., Stuart was on the run with his mare named Virginia. He had splashed into a tributary known as Plum Creek, and he was fleeing with other Confederate soldiers that were running away from about 25 to 30 Union soldiers that were on horseback. While they were pushed against with the rushing water, the Union would have been firing pistols at them as they were running away. And the stream, this is a current day picture of it. Back then it was known to be about 15 feet wide and as much as 4 feet deep in some parts. But they knew that if they could catch Stuart, this would be a huge win and morale booster.
Right. So Stuart ended up making it across the stream and into a farm, and he regrouped there with his men. And by that afternoon, he withdrew east of Hanover toward Jefferson and Seven Valleys, eventually making it to York, New Salem, and Dover. And the people of Hanover weren't rid of all the Confederate soldiers until almost dusk.
So by the next morning, on July 1st, Stuart hadn't been in contact with the commanding Confederate General Robert E. Lee, right? So Lee was about to run into the full force of the Union Army here in Gettysburg. So July 3rd, jumping forward a little bit, these 2 cavalries would meet again, obviously in the fields of Gettysburg, and again, Union troops would be outnumbered as they took on Stuart.
Right, so you're probably wondering, if you've been to Hanover, what's up with the statue in the square. So that's called the picket, and it's a life-sized bronze statue of a Union cavalryman on his horse on picket duty. And it's on a granite pedestal, and the sculptor is from Boston, and his name was Cyrus Dolan. And it was the men like this who prevented Stuart's cavalry from taking a direct path to reconnect with Robert E. Lee's forces. It was their job to scout and report back valuable information, and this left Lee without his most trusted eyes and ears, wasting precious time to take the long way around.
So I am not a Civil War historian, and so as I'm researching this, I know it's called the picket, and I had to ask Dami, like, what is a picket?
Yeah, so when you're in the Army in the Civil War, you're put on picket duty. So it's your job to go around the edges of your camp and your area and just make sure there's no enemies, there's no scouts looking at you. You're reporting back to the people in charge and telling them, hey, this is what I saw, or hey, there's no one out there, we're okay. So they're kind of your eyes and your ears, and they're making sure that camp is safe and that your position is safe.
Is that where like picket fence came from, I wonder?
I'm not sure which was used first.
Yeah, I mean, but the concept of like standing guard
Sure.
and protecting.
Like Pickett's Buffet here in Gettysburg.
Yeah. So it makes us wonder then, what did the civilians do while this was all happening?
Right. So as we said earlier, the Battle of Hanover was the bloodiest single event to take place on York County soil. So think about that for a second. So, you know, there's no designated spots for fighting. When a war breaks out and a battle breaks out, you fight where you're at, you fight where the enemy is. So
It's not like, hey guys, we're meeting at 12 on the field.
right,
like,
you
get
know,
out
as
there.
a reenactor, we get questions like, hey, why aren't there any bullet holes in the monuments? And it's not like, hey, we're all going to show up to a national park and fight there. You know, the national park was built afterwards. The monuments were put there after. So I think some people think like we got together ahead of time and we're like, hey, we're going to meet out in the field and fight at 12.
Yeah.
Like that did not happen. Sometimes you were surprising people. Sometimes you had really good intelligence ahead of time and you knew where they were going to be and they knew that you were coming for them. But sometimes, you know, it was just happened to be happenstance and they were there, you were there, and a battle breaks out. So
wherever
it
it
could be
was.
in the middle of town and there could be civilians all around you.
Well, and that's ultimately what happened
Yes.
when the Battle of Hanover broke out. The people in Hanover had to decide what they were going to do, and they stepped up to the plate. So they were able to build makeshift hospitals. And that's why this slide is called Hospitality Before Hostility. And other local historians, of course, use this. I think that may have been a Jim reference. So we use a lot of other people's work. Shout out to Scott Mingus, who is in the audience, and Jim McClure, and other historians who we've called on. So thank you for that. But when General Kilpatrick, he arrived in Hanover, he halted right outside of a community leader's house who was named Jacob Wirt, and his house was on Frederick Street. This is, if anyone's from Hanover, this is where the theater is now.
So at 8 a.m., Kilpatrick went inside of Wirt's home to review information and analyze maps of the area. Wirt welcomed him into the house, and this speaks to the seriousness of the day. Citizens knew this was a life or death situation, and they opened their homes to support the North. Union General George Cluster ended up sleeping in the Wirt house on the night of June 30th, and Kilpatrick slept in the Central Hotel, which is still standing on the northwest corner of the square. So I think it's really interesting that you can go to Hanover and you can see these Civil War era homes like you can here in Gettysburg.
Yeah, and they're still around.
Yes.
Yep. The importance of historical preservation.
Absolutely.
So not only then did the people in Hanover also build makeshift hospitals, but they were also willing to feed the people that were there.
Yes.
So Reverend William Zyber, he was the pastor of Emmanuel Reformed Church. He encouraged all the townspeople, the men, the women, the children, to contribute food to feed the soldiers that were there. So they had assembly of foods and drinks for the cavalry, such as breads, pretzels, pies, cakes, coffee, and even beer. I feel like standard York County fare. Like
That would boost your morale a little bit.
I, of course, would prefer the cake. Awesome. And then it was described as one dashing young lieutenant even bent down on one knee and kissed a woman's hand. Her name was Sally Weinbrenner, as a thank you for the big cakes that she gave him.
Nice.
So we encourage you, as you're going through today's presentation, to have your mind's eye going and picturing this. So I like to picture like a soldier genuinely bending down and kissing a woman's hand and saying, thank you so much for this cake.
I mean, when you've been away from your family and you're out marching 25 miles a day, you're drilling, you're going into battle, it's the little things like
Act
that
of kindness.
yeah, really boost your
There
morale.
was no 7-Eleven back then, guys.
So I'm going to read you a quote from Joanna Thomas. The morning of the battle, I went to the square with a wash bucket of bread and a kettle of apple butter and helped feed the soldiers that were coming into Hanover. The soldiers were awful tired and hungry and were glad to get the food that the people were giving them. The square was full of townspeople with baskets of food. Then word came that General Stuart and his cavalry were coming.
She continues, General Kilpatrick told us there was going to be fighting and we should all get off the street. I started to run home, but before I could get across the street, same as the rebel cavalry came along. The officers halted his men for a moment so we could get by. I ran and kept running until I got home. Just as I started through my door of my house, a bullet hit a rain spout, glanced off, and grazed my dress.
terrifying.
It is terrifying.
Yeah, not many people can say that they've been shot at before.
No.
So while the Union soldiers nourished themselves for the upcoming battle, the Confederates didn't waste any time. An artillery shell burst over the town, frightening the citizens. Major John Hammond rode to the center square, telling them to take shelter in their basements. Reverend Saber heard Hammond. In a few minutes, there will be fighting on the streets, he said. This was the last moment of peace before the storm of gunfire in Hanover. For many, it was their last meal, their last act of kindness, and for some of the men would ever enjoy.
So let's transition then to 3 days before the Battle of Hanover with the Confederates. And thinking about if you were to hear, it's like this is your home, right? This is where you live. This is where your house is, or your church is, where your store is, where your families are. If you heard that the enemy was coming in, what type of infrastructure would you try to take out to prevent them from getting to your house? Would you cut down trees? Would you dig up roads?
Burn bridges?
Bury bridges, yep. Well, I think one of the first things I would do is probably take out the Wi-Fi, if possible, right?
Sure.
Put up some barricades, if we could.
So on June 27th, Confederate Lieutenant Colonel Elijah White brought his Virginia battalion of 260 men to Pennsylvania. And they were on a mission to destroy our railroad bridges and telegraph lines.
So railroad bridges and telegraph lines.
Very important during the Civil War.
There's the two things that they tried to take out. There's a picture of him. So Daniel Trone, he played an instrumental role in Hanover with the railroads and the telegraph lines. So he was a telegraph operator for the Hanover Railroad since 1860. His office is at the present location of the Abraham Lincoln plaque, if you're familiar with where that is. He had worked in his office for 3 years, and he really didn't want to be destroyed by the enemy. I mean, again, imagine if this is your own house and you have to cut the Wi-Fi lines and cut down the bridges that you relied upon. It's devastating, but they were also at a crossroads where this was life and death. So he made the decision that they were going to interrupt their infrastructure. So while White's army stormed Hanover, Trone and other employees at first fled to Baltimore. He wrote to his boss, A.W. Eichelberger, president of the Hanover Branch Railroad, this:
I saw about a dozen rebels above Abdul Git and another man who I did not recognize coming as hard as they could right up the alley. The rebels were about 40 yards behind, and they shot at least a dozen times after them while going across the commons. As soon as I saw them coming, I pulled up my instruments and ran up to the garret of the railroad warehouse and hid them under the floor. When Trone returned to town, he telegraphed news about the Battle of Gettysburg to major northern cities. These news agencies were relying on Trone to tell the world what happened during those 3 days during the battle.
So when Trone then left Hanover, he took the town's form of communication with him when he left. So the Confederates, just so you're clear, also tore down telegraph lines along their journey, because without these telegraph lines, Hanover would be isolated. So they knew what they were doing as they were coming up to Hanover. They had just sustained White raid, and on the unseen of such trauma only worsened when without word. It also meant that Hanover couldn't help the communication needs of the Union Army during Gettysburg as well.
And while we're lucky that here in America we're not fighting any wars on our soil, you have to think about Israel, Palestine, Russia, and Ukraine, and the conflicts that are going on right now. For instance, in Ukraine, they knocked out all of their internet and Wi-Fi. I believe Elon Musk was able to put up some Starlink satellites to help them, but it really goes to show that even in our modern times, you can cripple an entire country and take out really important
communication
infrastructure. Yeah, absolutely.
So now let's get into the aftermath.
Yes.
So after the Battle of Hanover. So it was on the evening of June 30th, and the Battle of Hanover was over at this time, but the town was far from going back to business as normal, of course. So local physician and Good Samaritans, they set to work caring for the people who were wounded. They took them to the center square of the concert hall, and then later here, which was the Marion Hall, which is the present day on York Street.
And a few days later, a makeshift hospital opened within the Pleasant Hill Hotel. 42 recovering soldiers were immediately admitted to the hospital, and after the Battle of Gettysburg, the U.S. government rented the building as an official Army hospital, where about 150 men ended up receiving long-term treatment. Trains carried up to 14,000 wounded through Hanover to Baltimore, York, Philadelphia, and Harrisburg, and a double dose of death from both battles.
Yeah, from this and from
Yeah.
Gettysburg, yep. So at the time, there was a doctor, and his name was Dr. Perrin Gardner. He was a surgeon in charge of the hospital. He said this. He said, "It is supplied by the sympathetic people and administered to the suffering wounded by devoted women. A heartier response to the cause of humanity never came from more generous people that we have witnessed here." So if you're from Hanover, kudos to you. That's a good way to be remembered.
Yeah, absolutely. So while the doctors and the nurses aided the wounded, others cared for the corpses and the horse carcasses that lined the streets. And I feel like this is a part of the battle aftermath that people don't really think about.
Yeah.
They think about the human toll, but not necessarily the animals and the waste that was there. So the hot summer air meant decay and rot would set in very quickly. 39 men were killed, and probably over 40 is the actual number. Some men died days after the battle from injuries. So just because you didn't die immediately, unfortunately, didn't mean you weren't going to be one of the casualties.
That's why we have 39 plus up there.
So citizens carried Union bodies to a makeshift morgue in the nearby foundry, the current-day Trinity United Church of Christ. And they were placed in the Reformed Cemetery, one of Hanover's oldest graveyards. Union dead were reinterred at the Gettysburg National Cemetery, and the Confederates ended up being sent south.
So I know we're in Adams County, but let's talk about York County for a second. How many soldiers from York County served in the Civil War? Just throw out some guesses.
Shout it out. Anyone. Be brave.
20,000.
5,000.
All of them.
All of them. We have all of them and 5,000.
If I were to say 500, higher or lower?
Higher.
Okay. If I were to say 1,000, higher, lower?
Higher.
Higher? Really? You guys are doomsday. I'm seeing some people say no. What about 2,000? All right, let's.
This gentleman said 5,000. I'd say
5,000? All right, 5,000, higher or lower?
lower.
It was all of them.
It was 6,200.
Oh.
Yeah, 6,200 to a lot. A lot of men served from York County. Yep. Historians estimate that a total of about 600 York Countyans died from wounds and disease. Now, of course, do you remember how many men served, or how many soldiers died total in all of the Civil War? This should be an easy one.
650,000.
Yep, they say between 260 and then 750,000 total soldiers died in the Civil War. Now, this is more than American soldiers than any other war. Why is that?
All
More
the
American
sol-
soldiers in World War I, War II. Why is it?
All the soldiers were American.
Right. Every time you killed an enemy, you killed yourself. Right? American troops died. So that's why this number is so high compared to other wars as well.
And I just want to point out the beautiful picture of me that Jamie used for this slideshow tonight.
Tommy's great at dressing up, and then during the day dressing down in her wool, and she's got her tack. And so this is also fascinating. When we look at, so this photo right here is one of a kind. It's a one-of-a-kind photo. This is from February 6th of 1864. This is the only known image of the exhumation process of the Gettysburg reinterment. Yep. So workers would have used long metal hooks to pull up decomposed bodies from the graves. And you'll see this if you choose to do the walking tour of Hanover. This is on one of the storyboards. But I mean, you can see there the men pulling up the graves, and it was a dirty and gruesome process, but someone had to do it.
And it was hot, and it was humid, and yeah,
So
you
now-
didn't want to be there.
Let's get into Old Uncle Sam.
Yeah, so a lot of people assume that because York County is above the Mason-Dixon line that there were no enslaved peoples here, but you would be wrong. Pennsylvania's Gradual Abolition Act of 1780 was the first extensive piece of legislation to outlaw slavery, but it wasn't until the 1840s that the people were actually freed.
So today we learned a lot about the Battle of Hanover, but a lot of the fighting took place on Carl Forney's farm, which I showed you in the very beginning. And it was on this farm that the last formally enslaved person in York County worked. His name was Old Uncle Sam, and it was Carl's father, Marks Forney, who freed all of his family's enslaved peoples years earlier. Old Uncle Sam moved into a small rudimentary cabin near Mudtown, today known as Pennville, and he died in 1840. Today the land is developed into a strip mall. So another kind of known fact then of Hanover is the last known enslaved person worked on that land.
So Hanover stood in a direct path of an untold number of freedom seekers on their way to cross the Susquehanna River into the north. So remember when we mentioned Jacob Wirt, the community leader who welcomed General Kilpatrick into his home? He was also a conductor on the Underground Railroad. So the Underground Railroad was a secret network of houses, businesses, wagons, boats, and trails that assisted freedom seekers. Guides, or people who helped, were known as conductors. And Jacob Wirt gave the freedom seekers food, rest, and assistance on their journey to freedom.
And there was another Underground Railroad conductor, also by the name of Bill Piper. He was a fiddle player, and he was the grandson of a freed slave. He provided a lot of free passage from African Americans in his very small cabin that he had in the Westminster Road Commons. And prior to the Civil War, this is kind of a little sad. Prior to the Civil War, he grew mysteriously recluse, and he kind of cut himself away from his friends, because if you're conducting this life or death business where people's lives literally depend on you, he didn't want his friends to know what he was doing. So Bill Piper, the fiddle player, slowly started to pull himself back from his friends and family, because he understood that it was a federal offense to go against the Fugitive Slave Act, and helping others could have mean his own life is on the line.
Yeah, if you were doing it right, no one knew that you were doing it.
Which makes history really hard.
It does. So now we're going to talk about a forgotten lynching. So we're going to set the stage for you. On July 1st, around 4,500 Confederate cavalrymen passed through the region when Major General Jeb Stuart's division rode from Dover toward Carlisle via Dillsburg. Nearly 600 more horses were taken from the northwest York County. Warrington Township was hit particularly hard, and with nearly a quarter of the farms along the main roads known to have been raided at the time. Residents were really angry. 7 o'clock. That was perfect timing. Residents were angry about the stolen horses and the mules just as the summer harvest was nearing. We're gonna wait a second.
Is it just the lower one? So just so we're clear, there were about 1,000 horses stolen out of York County, but the 600 referenced the northwest section of it. So let's talk about the victim. So there was at least one rebel raiding party, like Jenkins' party, that happened between June 27th and June 29th. It was accompanied by a black man. We don't know if he was enslaved or if he was a servant, but he was the one who accompanied the troops on the expedition into Pennsylvania. He became very widely known in a short period of time for his horse thieving skills. Okay, very skilled at that. And he had been seen hanging around the area even after being warned to leave.
So who was a part of this lynch mob? So 8 different members of the Spar family lost horses to the Confederates over a 5-day period. So the family likely was brimming with hostility and angst over this thievery. And Jeremiah Miley Spar, who happens to be my 3rd great-grandfather, he was a soldier from Company H of the 87th Pennsylvania, which is the regiment that I reenact for. And he had just walked walked on his feet with just the things that he had on his body to his home following the Union defeat at the Second Battle of Winchester 3 weeks earlier. So if I was him, I can sympathize. I would be tired, I would be hungry, and I would be really upset.
And he wasn't alone either. There
Right.
were a few other people in this lynch mob, such as Spar's brothers, Lewis and Henry, his neighbor, who was also a local merchant by the name of William R. Smith. He had a country general store, which had been cleaned out by the rebels on June 29th. Again, someone who was very angry. Levi Reaver, he was a cabinet maker and he was a farmer, and Lewis Reeser, who, by the way, neither one of Lewis Reeser and Levi, they filed for post-war claims for losses that were incurred by the rebels.
So that brings us to the lynching. So the group found the black man in an area of the Big Conewago and Bermudian Creeks in southern Warrington Township. And after some verbal sparring, Jeremiah Spar ended up murdering the horse thief with at least 3 shots from his military-issued Springfield rifle.
They shot him 3 times.
Yes.
And this is the only lynching that happened in York County that we know of?
Might have been one other during the riots,
Okay.
but during the Civil War.
Okay, this is the main lynching then that we know of that happened. Yeah. So Scott Mingus is in the audience. He wrote that race could have absolutely played a role in this, But also, rebel thieves, white or black, would have likely been killed by an angry mob. Oh, and then also, so his body then, they hid his body under brush along the side of the road.
So after the victim's body was discovered and the coroner's inquest, two prominent Wellsville men, John E. Wells and David Cadwalder, pushed up for 6 men to be arrested. And it took several weeks for a grand jury to be convened in York under Judge Robert Fisher. But lacking sufficient evidence, the charges ended up being dismissed.
No charges were ever filed.
So what are the takeaways from this? This was York's only lynching on record during the Civil War, and nothing good came out of it, really. And it's a terrible case, and it comes when people take justice into their own hands. We can't be going out doing vigilante justice.
Right,
It
right.
just doesn't work.
Yep. So now, nearing the end of our presentation, you can't talk about Gettysburg and the Battle of Hanover without at least mentioning Abraham Lincoln.
My main man.
Did he really come to Hanover?
Yes.
We have a resounding
I hate
yes.
to tell you this, but
seen it.
you're right. Yes. Yep, so it was less than 5 months after the Battle of Hanover. Abraham Lincoln's train briefly stopped in Hanover on November 18th. What happened was his train had chugged down a main line at 5 p.m. and it had allowed a freight train to pass by, so it was getting out of the way. So his train slowly rolled onto this auxiliary line that was close to it to make room. When the train began to move again, Lincoln ducked his 6'4" frame through the coach's car doorway and said this:
I trust when the enemy was here, the citizens of Hanover were loyal to our country and the Stars and Stripes. If you are not, tell all true patriots in support of the Union, you should be. And he actually wasn't feeling well at this point, and he ended up being later diagnosed with smallpox. So his train then left for Gettysburg, where he delivered his famous Gettysburg Address.
So, we're hoping then that you walked away with these 3 takeaways. One is that the Battle of Hanover really was it was the first Civil War cavalry battle fought on free soil, and it was also the bloodiest single event that ever happened in York County history. We all expect you to know now trivia. If you're at a trivia event, you should know these facts. Second is that Hanover people should be remembered as defenders. This was a town of people who were unprepared, yet they stood up to the challenge and they were able to support people, the mass casualties, feed people, clothe people, and build those makeshift hospitals. Even though the outnumbered Union forces, then they kept the Confederate troops from invading. And then finally, the impact. So this prevented Lee from having his eyes and ears during the first half of the Battle of Gettysburg.
And our next episode of Hometown History is going to be on August 15th at Blue Sky Tavern. We're going to be talking about do-it-yourself urbanism. So if you're interested in seeing more Hometown History, you can watch it live on Facebook, or you can come to Blue Sky Tavern in Newburytown, where we live.
Yeah.